Today I'm going to make a homemade Sculptamold alternative. I hope you'll stay tuned. Hi, I'm really glad you could join me today. I've started to add some terrain to the layout, and I thought this would be a good time to show how I make a homemade Sculptamold alternative. Sculptamold is a fine product, but if you have a lot of terrain to cover, it can get a little spendy. Now, I know there's more videos on this subject than you can shake a stick at, but I thought I'd show my method and why I like it. I actually have two methods and a couple of variations on the first, so let's get to it. I start with paper shreds, just the shreds you get from a common paper shredder. Many people have shredders today, but at work we generate a fair amount of paper shreds. I could use them as is. I've tried and it works. It's too coarse for my tastes and it isn't really much like Sculptamold. So I use an old blender. Now you can't simply run the shreds through the blender. They're too light and they won't cycle down into the blades. So I put in enough paper shreds to cover the blades by an inch or two when compressed. Then add water to just cover the shreds. The water will allow the shreds to cycle down to the blades. Depending on how long you grind them, you can get them pretty fine. I've experimented and I prefer a medium texture. I then drain the shreds and squeeze out as much water as I can. As a variation to this method, for those who don't have a paper shredder, you can also use toilet paper. I use the cheapest toilet paper I can, the stuff you probably wouldn't want to use for its intended purpose. I simply roll up some of the toilet paper into balls and process them the same as the shreds. I even toss in the cardboard roll. Once the paper is ground, the next step is to dry it out. I spread the ground paper into a thin layer on baking sheets, put them in the oven at about 220 degrees, and bake them for around 2 hours. Then I turn off the oven and just let them dry out. I usually leave them overnight. In the morning, they're ready for the next step. Before I continue, this step generates a good bit of extremely fine paper dust. If you're going to use this method, please take proper precautions and wear a dust mask. I strongly advise you do this outside and keep kids, spouses, and pets away. Adult supervision is strongly encouraged if this method is to be used by anyone under 18. It's not worth saving a few bucks if you coat your lungs in fine paper dust. At this point, you're probably thinking that I haven't made much progress. I traded paper shreds for little nuggets of ground paper. But I was counting on that. These nuggets are dense enough and heavy enough that when run through the blender a second time, they will cycle down to the blades. Again, the amount of grinding time will determine how fine the resulting paper fiber is. If you watch the glass jar, you may be able to see the paper dust as the jar clouds. As soon as I open the lid, the jar clears. It's like a fog coming out of the jar. You can't see from this camera angle, but I am wearing a dust mask. It's very windy, so I'll just finish grinding the paper and take it inside where I can show you without it blowing away. This was the paper shreds. This is why I like this method. There are some stray shreds, but mostly it's been reduced to a fiber. This will allow a lot of surface area for the plaster to adhere to, making a very strong finished surface. I could have ground the shreds in the blender longer to get a finer consistency, but I like a medium texture. And again, the fiber from the toilet paper. This is a little bit finer than the paper shreds, as the toilet paper was thinner and softer than the office paper. I simply store the fiber in plastic bags until I'm ready to mix in the plaster and use it. To show how easy it is to work with, I'll mix some up for a small demonstration. This mix was made using the fiber from the paper shreds. I mixed this off camera. It's 3 parts paper fiber to 1 part plaster, by volume, not weight. When I measure the fiber, I press it into the measuring cup or whatever I'm using to ensure it's full with no voids, but I don't compress it too far. Just like the real Sculptamold, I add water until I get a consistency like cottage cheese. I have a sample board here with some white foam terrain. I simply spread the mixture over the foam structure. It happily sticks to vertical surfaces, staying right where I put it. I press it into place and lightly tap it to bring the water and plaster to the surface. Here I'll repeat the demonstration using the mix made from the toilet paper fiber. This was also mixed at a ratio of 3 parts paper fiber to 1 part plaster, just like the paper shreds. And I repeat the same process, spreading it over the foam, then tapping and smoothing the surface. Now this method is a little different. In place of the paper fiber, it uses sawdust. This is just sawdust I collected from the table and miter saws and from sanding various projects. I mix this at a ratio of 1 part sawdust to 1 part plaster by volume. This is because the sawdust is so much denser than the paper fiber. Just like before, water is added to bring it to the consistency of cottage cheese. This blend produces a finer texture and a very hard surface. It can be used in place of the paper fiber mixture, but I most often use it when I want to carve rocks into the surface. It sets up a good bit quicker, so there's less waiting time between carving. However, I do a small area at a time because it does set up so much quicker. Now, if I was going to carve rocks into this, I would be starting pretty soon. The mixture is already getting warm, so the exothermic reaction has started. It'll begin to set up pretty quickly now. After the paper fiber mixture has had a few minutes to set up, I come back to smooth it out some more. I can work it to whatever degree of smoothness I want, sometimes even dipping my finger in some water and tapping the surface. Fingers usually work well enough, but you can use a putty knife if you prefer, dipping it in water as needed. I'm using a small putty knife from my carving tool set, only because it's handy. Okay, I'm going to let these set up. It's getting late, so I'll check on them in the morning. It's been about 16 hours. Everything is set up nice and hard. The surface is still a little damp, but plaster would be damp after 16 hours. I did come back after about 2 hours and everything was already set up then. As you can see, what I put on the vertical surfaces has stayed put. As for the sawdust mixture, it too has set up nice and hard and stayed put on the vertical surfaces. It's slightly damp, but actually a good bit drier than the paper fiber mixtures. That's pretty much it for this demonstration. If this were terrain on my layout, it would be ready for painting, ground cover, whatever I was going to do with it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and comment. I'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe and hit that little bell icon. This way we can share this great hobby together. Thanks a lot for joining me today. Till next time.